I'm involved in the CAP ministry, or Christians Against Poverty, and I have been involved in this ministry since December 2010. Christians Against Poverty is a debt counseling charity that helps families or individuals who are in debt. We also run a successful job club program, which has a success rate of 98% of participants attending the course and finding jobs straight after that. And we also run a life skills course. We work in partnership with Vision West. We run the program there at their Manurewa, Luke Street and Blockhouse Bay complex. I've seen lives transformed by the grace and the love of Jesus, as we've seen over 160 individuals receive salvation. I've seen lifestyle changes when clients become debt-free. And we've seen over 200 clients become debt-free. Last year, we received stats from CAP New Zealand head office to say that our center here at Greenland, we have cleared over $2 million worth of debts. When you give, you are partnering with us in the work that we do. He waka eke noa is a Maori proverb which means we are all in this together. We partner together as Jesus' hands and feet into the community. And every dollar given, every prayer, every cans of bake being dropped into the CAP food box helps us to do the work that we do. Jesus said that whatever you do to the least of this, you are doing it unto me.
Yeah, that deserves a round of applause, doesn't it? Well, kia ora e te whānau. It's great to be with you, whether you're here in Green Lane, whether you're watching online, or also to those of you at East. A big shout out to you. This is being broadcast in an hour's time to our East congregation. So kia ora to you guys as well. I'm in awe of Christians Against Poverty and the ministry they have right across New Zealand. I came across CAP about 10 years ago and was struck with the incredible ministry they do. But some of those statistics about the CAP ministry here at Grace City that Latia just shared are outstanding, aren't they? 160 people have found Jesus through this ministry. Over 200 families are now debt-free because of what they are doing. And as you leave today, as Mel and Ming were saying, you're going to see this ministry fair and expo at Green Lane here. If you're at East, we're going to be doing the same thing next Sunday in the foyer at East. But today, out in the foyer here at Grace City, Green Lane, you can get the chance to see CAP and Hub of Hope and Loaves and Fishes and our prison ministry and Barnabas School of Leadership. I'll be there in my Kenya shirt. And a whole stack load of other ministries that are all part of Grace City and are all doing incredible things. And this is what this 3-week series, Something Bigger, is all about. As one of our key values as a church says, as I said last week, we're part of something bigger. And that's what today is about, showcasing many of these ministries. But that's what we're celebrating too over these 3 weeks. And as part of that, we are exploring together some significant parables that Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 13. We call these kingdom parables, as I said last week, because they are stories that Jesus told, all centered around the idea of this kingdom that he has come to establish. So last week, we were looking at these two parallel parables that go together, a story about treasure and a story about a pearl. Today, we're coming to the very beginning of Matthew chapter 13 and looking at the longest and probably best known of all of these parables. It's called the parable of the sower. So this is how Jesus began as he launched into this parable to tell to the crowd. It says in Matthew chapter 13, verse 1, that same day Jesus went out of the house and he sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat in it while all of the people stood on the shore. So Jesus is continuing his ministry. He is drawing huge crowds around him who are impressed not only by his miracles that he's performing, the healings that he does, but his teaching that's so profound. So the crowds are growing, and this day as he sits down to teach by the Sea of Galilee, the crowds are flocking to him to the point he needs to get up off the shoreline and actually go get in a boat and push out from shore so he can get a better view and use the water to help the acoustics. So he's teaching them there, sitting from the boat. Verse 3 tells us, "Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed." Now, I said last week that what parables are made-up stories. They're fictional stories. They're not about anyone in particular. They're based out of ordinary life. So they're fictional stories, but they're stories that have a spiritual punch. Jesus is telling something significant about his kingdom within these stories that he makes up. And this opening story is about a farmer. Jesus said there's a farmer who goes out to sow seed in his field. Now, the way they did that is different to the way some of you may have a veggie garden. I remember growing up, my mum and dad had a big veggie garden out the back of the garage at our house in Napier. And when it came time to start planting, and I have no clue when that would be in the year, but whenever that was, they would start planting, and they would get a little bag of say, tomato seeds, and they would plant one seed at a time in a nice, beautiful row, with a little marker at one end saying tomatoes, and that's how they would plant the veggie garden. It's completely different to what Jesus is talking about in this parable. In this parable, what people would do, Jesus is talking about an ordinary farmer in his day would put a bag of seed, like in a bag over the shoulder or wrapped around the waist, and the farmer would dip a handful of seeds in the hand and would walk along in a straight line, slowly casting out the seed as they walked. And so the seed would just be dispersed, and either the farmer in some cases would have tilled the soil, plowed the soil before sowing. Other times they'd sow the seed first, and then they would plow it and kind of churn it all in. So that's the background to this story that Jesus tells that many people, all of the people, would have been utterly familiar with. He says a sower goes out and he sows on the field, and what Jesus highlights in his parable, in his story, is 4 types of soil that the seed lands on. The first one, he says, is some of the seed fell on hard soil. And so I'm symbolizing each of these, a little bit of show and tell today. And so this first soil, the hard soil, is symbolized by tramping boots. Because the reason some of the soil was hard is that around the edges of a field is where the people walked. So if you were walking through someone's field, you would never cut right across the middle of it, because you could be taking out precious crops. You would always walk around the edges, and as people walk around the edges of a field, they would trample the dirt down so much it became incredibly hard. So as a sower sows seed, the seed can't enter the soil. It's as hard as pavement. So there's this hard soil. Secondly, Jesus says some of the seeds fell onto stony or rocky soil. And what that doesn't mean is there was just stones intermingled, because normally a farmer would have already taken out the stones and have used them to build often like a stone wall or something around the field. What it's referring to is that often in different parts in the land of Israel, there would be these big hunks of stone just beneath the surface of the soil. So you look across a field that a farmer was planting in, and it could look like it's really beautiful soil everywhere. But in certain places within that field, there could be parts where about this far underneath the soil, there's this kind of rock bed, which means as people are planting the soil, the roots begin to come down, but they don't go down very far until they hit rock. So there's no root system to those plants, and that part of the field, if there's hidden rock there, those plants are going to die. Thirdly, then, Jesus says, there's other parts that end up, very carefully. Oh, that'll do. These are some thorns from a rose bush at home. Roses are beautiful, but these thorns are horrible. And Jesus says some of the seed, as it's being sown, it fell into an area where there was thorns. Now again, as a farmer is planting, if they've ploughed the land already, there are no thorn bushes to be seen. But beneath the surface, there's roots of past thorn bushes, or there's seeds that have been scattered in the wind of thorns. And as Jesus tells his parable, he says, this farmer is sowing seed, but these thorns are going to grow up far quicker than the wheat is, than the crops are, and they're going to end up choking out the crop of the farmer. So there's this hard soil, and there's rocky soil, and there's thorny soil. And Jesus says, but finally, there is some of that seed will fall onto good soil, and a crop will grow, and it will produce this beautiful, tremendous harvest. Isn't that a beautiful story? A farmer's out sowing seed, and the seed can fall in these different soils, but some of the soil, that crop is going to grow and produce a beautiful harvest. And then Jesus says this interesting statement at the very end of this parable. In verse 9, Jesus concludes with these words: whoever has ears, let him hear. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Well, last time I looked, we all have ears. I mean, put your hand up if you don't have ears. That would be an oxymoron, wouldn't it? Because you wouldn't hear me to say that, to put your hand up. So Jesus is speaking to everyone, but he's giving a challenge here. He's saying, hey, are you listening to what I'm saying? Because this is a parable. A parable is this fictional story that packs a spiritual punch. Jesus is not giving a lesson on horticulture. This is not Jesus' 5 tips for a better crop harvest. Jesus is speaking spiritual truth, so he finishes his story about the soil, and he turns to the crowd listening to him all over the bank of the shore, and he says, are you listening to me? Who's actually got ears to hear what I'm really saying? So Jesus tells this parable. And then later on in Matthew 13, he will then give the meaning of this. He will sit down with his disciples and he will provide the meaning of what this parable is all about. He doesn't do this with the full crowd, and he doesn't do this actually with most of his parables. But with this one, he sits down later with his disciples and he helps them understand it. So here's what he says to the disciples later on, verse 18. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. So Jesus goes, okay guys, let me help you understand this. The seed of the sower, the seed is the message about my kingdom. It's the message about me as the king. And as that message gets shared, sometimes that message falls onto someone's heart that's represented by the hard soil, trampled soil. The seed doesn't penetrate. In other words, Jesus is saying that the hard soil represents a hardened heart. That's a hardened heart. Some people hear the message of Jesus and just aren't interested. Now, what he says here is fascinating in verse 19. He says, there are some people who hear the message of the kingdom and do not understand it. And that's not a statement about intellect. Jesus is not saying there are some people and they're just not as clever as the rest of us. They're really thick and they don't get it. To say they don't understand is not a statement about intellect. It's a statement about spiritual responsiveness. He's saying there are people who will hear the message of my kingdom and they are just not interested. Now, what's really interesting is that Jesus has told this parable earlier in Matthew 13. Matthew began, verse 1 that we read earlier, he began with these 3 significant words, that same day, which takes you back into the previous couple of chapters of Matthew, Matthew 11 and 12. And what's happening in Matthew's gospel is that while the crowds are growing and flocking to hear Jesus, the opposition to Jesus is also growing. Jesus is coming into more and more conflict with the religious leaders of Israel who don't think he's the Messiah and who oppose him. And as the crowds of ordinary people are coming, many of them are turning away from Jesus. So in Matthew 11, Jesus pronounces judgment on some of the towns of Israel because the people are rejecting him. So as Jesus is telling this parable and he talks about there are some soils that are just, there's some hearts that are just hard and reject me. He's highlighting many of the people sitting in that crowd to whom he told the parable. The hard soil represents a hardened heart. And then you come to the stony soil, the rocky soil. Here's what Jesus says about them in verse 20. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So in the next part of the parable, Jesus is describing seed that's been sown, and there's initially a little bit of growth, a little bit of response. But over time, because of this rock underneath, it just dies off. And what Jesus is talking about here is another type of person. Doesn't have a hard heart. There's an initial, oh, this is interesting. I kind of like what I'm hearing about Jesus. But over time, that interest dies away. In fact, at the very end of that verse 21, Jesus says, when trouble comes because of the message, they quickly fall away. The word that the NIV's translated there, fall away, is a Greek word that you will recognize. The Greek word is they are scandalized. So into English, you could translate that, they are scandalized. In other words, some people hear the message of Jesus and initially they're attracted to Jesus. They like some of what Jesus is about. They like some of the stuff that he says. But then they begin to hear some of the other stuff Jesus says. He talks about God's love for ordinary, messed up, broken people. But then they also hear that Jesus is talking about the judgment of God. Jesus talks about how actually you need to obey the law from your heart. Jesus turns around and says, you want to follow me? You have to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. And over time, Jesus is saying, there are people who initially are attracted to me and my message, but over time, they will take offense at what I say. When Jesus' message confronts the world we live in and the society that we live in, people are scandalized. When Jesus' message confronts the self-centeredness of our own hearts, many people are offended by that and walk away. So while the hard soil represents a hardened heart, the rocky soil represents an offended heart. From someone who begins out and starts out thinking, Jesus is pretty cool, but over time they go, there's no way that I'm interested in a message like that. And they're offended by him. And then we come to the thorny heart. Here's what Jesus says in the next verse. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. So Jesus is saying there are other people whose hearts are similar to the people who get offended, where there's an initial interest in Jesus, but over time that interest just gets choked away. So in other words, this thorny soil represents what we could call a crowded heart. It's a crowded heart, where ordinary life just gets in the way of living for Jesus. And Jesus highlights two things in particular. Have you noticed there? Worry and wealth. He just says you find people who will initially respond, who initially be interested, but over time just the worries of ordinary life, the pursuit of wealth, which it doesn't matter how much you have. Most of us want more. Materialism is one of the greatest challenges to the kingdom of God everywhere in the world. And Jesus says the reality is that there will be people who show some interest in my message and my kingdom, but over time, life just gets too busy. And then finally, Jesus says, but there are some who respond. There is good soil. And he says in verse 23, but the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and who understands it. And this is the one who produces a crop, yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. Again, just like that hardened heart at the beginning, Jesus talks about hearing the message of his kingdom and understanding it. And again, understanding it isn't an intellectual comment. It doesn't mean, well, you're brighter than someone else. It means you're more responsive than someone else. You're listening to what Jesus is saying. And people who are represented by the good soil are people who have a responsive heart, who hear the message of Jesus and go, that's what I want to be part of. I want to be part of that kingdom. I want to follow that king. I want to take the gift that he offers so graciously of life and forgiveness and hope and relationship. And because of that, Jesus says, those kinds of lives, the responsive heart, it produces a fruit. It produces a crop. And that crop can look different in different people's lives, but there is change and there is impact because of a responsiveness. So what Jesus is telling, remember, he's now giving the meaning of this to his disciples. What he's wanting his disciples to understand is as the message of the kingdom goes out, different hearts respond differently to that message. It's the same seed. It's the same message being shared, but it has a different impact, and that's because there are different kinds of hearts that will respond in different kinds of ways. So Jesus has told this parable, and then a little later in the chapter, he's given the meaning to his disciples. But in between, there's a chunk of the story that almost all of us just jump over and skip. See, we skipped verses 10 to 17. And what I realized is as I was looking at this parable, I have skipped these verses so often in my life. I've never stopped to think about what Jesus says in between telling the parable and giving its meaning. Because what Jesus does here is he highlights the lesson that he is trying to get across. He highlights the key idea. And he does it because in verse 10, his disciples come to him and say, "Why are you talking in parables? You haven't been doing this up till this point in the story. You've been just giving teaching. You gave that cool Sermon on the Mount earlier, and you're telling people stuff. And now you're telling these kind of slightly bizarre stories about dudes who are sowing, farmers who are sowing seed. Why are you doing that?" Listen to Jesus' response in verses 11 and 12. Jesus replied, "Because, the reason I'm teaching in parables, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you guys, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance, and whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them." And then he adds, "This is why I'm speaking in parables." Now this is really, really counterintuitive. Most of us have been taught, in fact I have taught, that the reason Jesus spoke in parables is because he used ordinary, everyday examples from life to explain stuff clearly to people. Jesus taught in parables for clarity. But that isn't what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I'm teaching in parables so that the people who have a responsive heart will get it. And the people who don't have a responsive heart won't get it. You see, parables both reveal and conceal depending on the condition of your heart. That's why Jesus will share a parable like he does of the sower, and he says at the end, "Now, are you listening?" Because if your heart is primed and responsive to hear, then you'll listen and you'll get it. And if your heart is not primed to hear, if you're being choked off by all the busyness of life, or you're going to get offended by some of the hard stuff Jesus says, or you just can't be, you're not interested in him, you're opposed to him, you're not going to get the parables. He's talking about the condition of the heart, and he wants his disciples to understand because he's about to pass the kingdom to them. And they're going to be going out and sowing the message of the kingdom. And he wants his disciples to understand there are different hearts out there, and you're going to get all kinds of responses, and the problem is not the seed. The problem's not the message. It's the condition of the heart. And to sum that up, Jesus then quotes from the prophet Isaiah, from Isaiah 6. He says, this is what Isaiah said, "You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For these people's hearts have become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes." See, Jesus is wanting us to understand, as his followers today, that we are part of this grand business of sowing and sharing the message of the kingdom, and the response we get will be utterly varied. And the problem is not the seed. The problem is not the message. We don't need to change it. We don't need to dumb it down. We don't need to take off the bits that are more controversial or harder to understand. We just need to sow the seed and share the message. And there will be different responses, and we should not be surprised if there's a hardened heart, and there's a heart that is scandalized and takes offense at Jesus. And there's a heart that just gets crowded out. And sometimes there's a heart that responds. Jesus is wanting us to not be surprised by that. See, this is the key idea that Jesus is communicating in this parable. We are part of something intriguing. We are part of something mysterious. We are part of something, dare I say it, provocative. And some people will hear this and some people will not. We are part of this grand kingdom that Jesus is building. We're part of something bigger. That's what this whole series is all about. And we're part of something invaluable, as we saw last week, but we're part of something intriguing. We're part of something mysterious. And not everyone we share this with is going to understand it or embrace it. So as we finish today, I want us to think about how this applies to our lives in two different ways. First of all, how do we respond to this as a hearer? How do we respond to this parable as people who are hearing the teaching of Jesus? Well, what Jesus is saying here is that ultimately people's hearts are either open or closed to this message of his kingdom. And some people who are offended, some people who are busy, some people who have a hard heart, they're all closed to him. So what that means is if you're here and you've come with a friend to church and you're wondering about what it means to follow Jesus, what this whole church thing is all about, or if you're online and you're exploring Christianity and you've stumbled on Grace City and you're watching some stuff online, here's what you need to understand. Jesus is actually issuing a challenge here. The challenge is this: are you listening? Do you have ears to hear? And Jesus is giving this almost a warning to all who are coming and thinking and wondering about what it means to follow him. He's saying it's very easy to harden your heart. It's very easy to get distracted by the busyness of life. It's very easy to actually get scandalized by some of the real tough stuff Jesus says. But Jesus urges you to hear. He urges you to listen. Would you come with an open heart and a responsive heart? Would you show yourself to have a heart of good soil? Because we're part of something intriguing, we're part of something mysterious, and not everyone accepts this. Will you? Will you hear what Jesus is saying? By the way, that means for those of you who have accepted that, which is most of you in the room, most of you at East, many watching online, if you have accepted this message of Jesus, if you've responded to him as the king, you've entered his kingdom by putting your faith in him, you're good soil. That's what Jesus is saying. Well done. You've heard, you've listened, you've responded, you've bowed the knee to me as your king. In fact, here's what he says at the end of this little section, verse 16. He looks at his disciples and he says this, and this could be said over you if you are his follower and part of his kingdom today. Blessed are your eyes because they see, and blessed are your ears because they hear. And he says to his disciples, truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see and didn't see it. They long to hear what you hear and did not. But you guys have, he says to his disciples. And you guys have, he whispers to Grace City in Auckland. You've heard, you've listened, you've responded. Well done. As we saw last week, if you've responded to Jesus by faith, if you've trusted in him as the king of the kingdom, you've won the jackpot, baby. You've got the prize. And what you've shown is that your soil, the soil of your heart, is a good soil. And God is producing in you a crop. It may be different to the person next to you, but he is doing something in you and through you. So well done. The second way I want to finish applying this is not only how are we meant to respond as a hearer, but how are we meant to respond to this parable as a sower. How do we respond as a sower? Because as I said earlier, the disciples were going to be given the responsibility for sowing the seed, for sharing this message when Jesus returned to heaven. That responsibility has now been passed down to every follower of Jesus, and that's now in all of our hands. We are now sowers. We now carry the message of this kingdom as we go about our world and our lives. And what Jesus wanted his disciples to understand is the same thing he wants you and I to understand. We are called to faithfully sow the seed and scatter the message wherever we go. But the response isn't up to us. The response depends on the heart in which that seed falls. And sometimes it will take root and grow and people will respond, and many times it will not, and that's okay. Don't get discouraged. Just keep sowing the seed that God has placed into our hands. And that's, folks, that's what I love about all of these ministries that we're going to go out and look at and talk to and have conversations about as we finish the service today and next week at East as well. It's an opportunity to go to talk to Alan and Kay about loaves and fishes and what they're doing as they go and feed people and preach the message out on the streets. You have a chance to talk to Jace, who's part of Athletes in Action on the university campuses. I'm part of his prayer support team. Why don't you go chat to him and sign up to be part of that as well? It's an opportunity to find out what CAP is doing, to talk to the prison ministry, to find out more about Mike and Hub of Hope. What a cool opportunity, because part of what we sow is that we can sow our prayers and we can sow our finances and we can get them behind these very cool ministries that are part of our church. But we also get the opportunity to go to our workplace tomorrow, to sit in the staff room in between teaching children, to go onto the building site with the team we work with, to sit in our cubicle in the open office, to sit at the cafe with the group of young mums, and to look for opportunities to just quietly sow some seeds and see what God might do. On Tuesday, I went to our local barber's for a haircut. And I sat down in the seat in the barber shop nearest to us in the little shopping centre near our home. It's actually owned by Muslims. And so I get my hair cut, A, because it's local, and B, because it's kind of a place where I can try and sow some seed. And I book online and I just pick, give me whoever. I don't mind, just give me whichever barber. And so on Tuesday, I ended up sitting in the barber seat of a young guy I'd never seen there before. And his name was Carr. And he's Muslim, and I discovered he's from Iraq. He was born in Iraq, came out with his family as an 8-year-old, as a refugee. He's now studying at university, studying engineering. And as we're chatting away, he inevitably asks, what do you do? And that's always a fantastic question for a pastor, because you're either going to have a good conversation or you're going to kill it. And so I say, I'm a pastor. But he was intrigued. And so he started asking me a few questions. He asked me, was I a serious Christian? Which was a fascinating question for a Muslim to ask. He asked me if I'd been raised in a Christian family. And I said, I had. He said, so you're a Christian because of the family you were raised in? And I said, no, I'm not. I said, I'm a Christian because I was raised in that faith, but I investigated it for myself to be sure that I believed it was true. And I ended up being utterly convinced that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and he's far more than just a prophet. And I put my faith in him. And Karat then changed the subject to something else. But I'd taken that little sliver of time to just plant a few seeds. I don't know what God will do. I have no control over that. I don't know if he'll be in the barber place next time because he's a full-time uni student. I don't know if I'll ever have him cut my hair again. And I don't know how he will respond, but that, friends, is not my job, and it's not yours. We're part of something intriguing. We're part of something mysterious and provocative. Our call is to plant the seed. And let's see where it falls and what God might do. Lord Jesus, thank you for the story that you shared. Thank you for the reminder that you came and you were rejected by so many people. As you share the message of your kingdom, there were people who were hardened against you. There were people who were interested, but just the busyness of life crowded it all out. There were others who initially liked you and then turned against you and were scandalized. But Lord Jesus, there were some who responded. There was some good soil where the seed fell. And what a beautiful reminder to your disciples as they took up the mantle of this ministry after you went to heaven. And what a beautiful reminder to us as we continue this ministry today. That it's not our responsibility to worry about the hearts. That we can't even look across the soil and know what kind of soil that is. We just simply share the message of your kingdom by faith. So we pray that you would help us to do it. Thank you that we are part of something bigger. Thank you that we are part of something incredibly invaluable. And thank you that we're part of something intriguing. Help us to be faithful, we pray, this coming week even, to sow the seed and to support these beautiful ministries who are doing the same. We trust you to be at work in us, Jesus, by your Spirit, in your name. Amen.